first, we'll talk to weaving Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge systems to shift from synergies and trade-offs to holistic perspectives. We'll discuss authentic partnerships where knowledge is co-created rather than just exchanged to enable context-specific and culturally relevant climate action and sustainable development to address community needs. And finally, we'll discuss how to include the voices and expertise of Indigenous peoples and local communities, especially to challenge traditional hierarchies in knowledge production, to drive more transformative solutions that address underlying vulnerabilities. It's my pleasure to introduce 4 panelists who will be joining us today, 2 remotely and 2 in person. Our first talk will be given by Dr. Meryl Ballard. Meryl is a Canadian research chair in weaving Indigenous science and sustainability science and is an associate professor in the Department of Earth, Energy and Environment at the University of Calgary. She stood up the new Indigenous Science Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada and is Anishinaabe from Lake St. Martin First Nation. Dr. Ballard's latest research explores three-eyed seeing and how her fluency in Anishinaabe-Moan can transform approaches to water resource management using Anishinaabe-Moan baseline indicators. Dr. Ballard has served on a number of committees and working groups, including IPCC, and also holds multiple awards. Her other research interests include, but are not limited to, climate change and sustainability of flooding and displacements. So with that, I'm going to first ask Dr. Ballard, who is presenting remotely, to provide us with a framing talk. And I'll introduce each panelist in turn when they come to make their comments. So over to you, Meryl.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Dr. Ballard.
I know, I'm so sorry. It's early here.
Okay. Can you see my slide okay? Yeah.
Yes, it looks great.
Good morning. Good evening, everyone. Right now it's 11 p.m. Where I'm joining you from, and it's still Wednesday. So glad to be joining you from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So the talk that I'm going to do is bridging, braiding, and weaving Indigenous and local knowledges in SDGs and climate change synergies. Excuse me. Do you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, we hear you just fine.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to give a list of the SDGs so you know them all. I'm not going to go through each one, but the reason I put this up is because Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge applies to each one of these ones, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about them and the application of the SDG to Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. So when we talk about bridging Indigenous science and Western science and the SDGs, we have to know a little bit of the difference between them. And the list on the left gives an example of what Indigenous science is, and the one on the right is the Western science. So Indigenous science is about the knowledge of the environment and the knowledge of the ecosystem, and it's Indigenous science is about the environment, and it's holistic, whereas Western science is very siloed. And Indigenous science is about real-time events, occurring events. It's events that are evolving. It's about the real-time changes that are happening on the land, the waters. It's about climate change. And Western science, we Western researchers usually go to the land when they learn about uh, the changes after. And it's usually Indigenous peoples that identify the real-time changes that are happening. And they're the first responders of the land. And Indigenous science is about the relational values that Indigenous peoples have with the land, with the environment around them. And with the Western, it's about the non-relational. And Indigenous science is its own science and it's not part of Western science. So therefore, we cannot integrate the two, but we can breed the two and we can weave the two. And Indigenous science is non-reductive and Western science is reductive. Indigenous science is about experiential learning, and it's about growing up with the Indigenous science and the Indigenous knowledge, whereas Western science is mostly taught in the classroom. And it's based on respect, the responsibility, and the relationships that we have with our relations, meaning the land, the water, the air, the flora, fauna, and everything. And the Western science is usually unilateral, just one, and it's a relational values according to the larger society as a whole. And when we talk about the bridging and braiding, for example, the SDG no poverty, the zero hunger, and when we look at these, we can learn from what Indigenous peoples are doing right now. And if we take away the policies that inhibited Indigenous peoples' relationship to the land, because there's a lot of policies that are in place that prevent Indigenous peoples from doing their rightful role as biodiversity stewards of the land, and then we wouldn't have poverty within the First Nation communities, Indigenous communities around the world. When we talk about the zero hunger, the land that Indigenous peoples are on, the land once provided food for them, but taking away their ability to provide for themselves takes away that ability to take care of themselves. So we have to learn from Indigenous peoples the way they did before the legislation that came into effect, the policies that are in place. Indigenous peoples take from the land, they only take what they need. For example, if they kill a moose, they only take what they need. They don't kill 1,000 moose. They just take one. And it's about the reciprocity. It's relational, and we can learn. We can learn from Indigenous peoples stewardship of the land in order to address, mitigate that climate action. And when we combine these two, no poverty and Indigenous stewardship, and to take from the land what is needed, just what is needed, we can all be we can all have a good health and well-being. And this is a part of the Indigenous people's sustainable stewardship. Biodiversity is really important. These are part of the SDGs. Indigenous peoples represent only a 10%, less than 10% of the world's population, but Indigenous peoples protect more than 80% of the biodiversity. Indigenous peoples protect our relations, meaning that they protect the lands, they protect the water, they protect what's under the water, they protect what's on the land, and these are part of the SDGs. And another critical thing that's part of the Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge is the protection and conservation, which is embedded in the Indigenous languages. Excuse me. A lot of Indigenous places and spaces across Canada, for example, across the Americas, for example, they have words that are rooted within the Indigenous language. And it's very important to learn what these places mean. The places, the naming of the rivers, for example, the lakes, the landscape. And they hold a lot of knowledge regarding the way the landscape was, the way the waters were, because they hold the original naming of the places where the Indigenous people named them, which was according to their function, to the role within the ecosystem. And it's really important to preserve language with Indigenous peoples. And again, this is the preservation of language can be part of the SDGs in getting a proper education. So when we look at weaving, what I talked about regarding the Indigenous science, we talk about stewardship laws. And being Anishinaabe, I'm going to talk about the Anishinaabe stewardship laws. So there's different forms of stewardship laws with Indigenous peoples, but they have the same concepts. We talk about the natural law, the traditional law, the creation law, and the language law. And the natural law refers to the way the earth was formed. For example, the rivers, lakes, the way they were formed, the landscapes, and they all have a purpose. And when we start manipulating the natural laws, and that's when we start seeing problems with the land, with the water, etc., because the manipulation goes against the natural laws. And the traditional laws is the way Indigenous peoples would teach one another, like the way to treat lands, the way to treat each other, for example. And the creation law refers to the overall the universe, the way it was created, the function of the universe, the earth, etc., and everything that revolves around the earth. That's the creation law. Language law is what I talked about regarding the significance of language when it comes to the protection and the conservation of biodiversity, because the language, indigenous language, is really important. And we can learn from the Anishinaabe stewardship laws when we want to mitigate climate change, when we want to look after what's below the water, when we look after the water and what's living in the water. Those are our relations. And when we want to look at what's on the land, again, those are our relations that we have to look after and based on the stewardship laws. And we can learn from Indigenous peoples regarding their Indigenous science. We can learn a lot from them because they're the first responders of the land. They know when things are happening within the waters. They know what's happening on the land. And a lot of science, we can link it to Western science because we need to use both sciences. When we do monitoring on the land, we do a lot of ground truthing because we have to identify the places and identify what the changes are within the land. So the work that I do is working a lot with Indigenous knowledge holders because they're the ones that have a knowledge of the land, of the waters, and I want to learn from them. And we should all learn from them. When we start to manipulate the lands and the waters, we destroy the biodiversity. We go against the natural law. We go against the language law. We go against the creation law, the traditional law, everything. And when we go against these laws, that's when we start to see changes within the earth, like we start to see floods. And according to Indigenous peoples, when the land weeps from the floods, this is when the earth is crying. Lake Winnipeg, where I'm from, Lake Winnipeg is in danger right now. And Indigenous peoples, as the protectors of the land, as stewards of the land, they're taking action where they're going to go to court to protect Lake Winnipeg. And these actions are drastic, but we have to be the voice for the waters. We have to be the voice for the land, and we have to do whatever it takes to protect the waters. Indigenous peoples are the ones that are protecting and conserving waters. For example, the rivers in the Magpie River in Quebec, the Magpie River in Canada. This was taken by the Indigenous people who gave the Magpie River personhood and giving the Magpie River a voice. And the Amazon River is another example where the Indigenous peoples gave it legalhood as well, personhood. And the Wanganui River in New Zealand is another example. When we start manipulating the water by damming and diverting, we create floods. A lot of them are artificial floods because they're man-made from releasing water from control structures. When we manipulate the water, this affects the ability to have clean water. And it's using indigenous peoples that live downstream from these water diversions, and they're the ones that are impacted. This was taken in where I'm from. This was from about the 50 years of the flooding of the land. And what happens is when you continuously flood the land, the groundwater starts coming up and the overland. These tree stands, there's a bunch of tree stands dispersed throughout the region and that are dead. And the indigenous peoples know that the roots are rotting. And this, when there's no green, this this contributes directly to climate change. And this is on Lake Winnipeg. Again, indigenous peoples identified the algae that are in the waters, and they destroy the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples because the indigenous peoples rely on fisheries for their livelihood. And when the waters start getting warmer, there's no more livelihood. And we can work with indigenous and Western science. It's very important to combine the two sciences where we can braid and weave the two sciences for better synergies, climate action. Indigenous peoples are very important because they have the knowledge, and we have to start using their knowledge and the work that we do as I don't know what to call ourselves. When we start destroying the waters, when we start destroying the land, we have to think of our relations. Where are they going to live when the water is gone, when the water disappears? Where are they going to live? And what will we drink when the water is gone, when the water is contaminated? So these are the things that we have to start thinking about, and we have to start coming together with both of the knowledges and come up with solutions. So this is some of the work that I do with Indigenous peoples, and I want to thank you for listening to me.
Meryl, thank you so much for that presentation, and I think really highlighting not just sort of highlighting that some of the ways, some of even these approaches of really atomizing the SDGs themselves may run against some of the goals that they embody. I'm now going to invite Debbie Lay, followed by Popular Gentle, to provide some additional comments related to Indigenous knowledges and local knowledges as we see them both in their local to global manifestations. So Dr. Deborah Lay is Chief of the Energy and Natural Resources Unit of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. She's a lead author and a coordinating lead author for IBIS's Nexus report, the UN's Global Environmental Outlook, IPCC's 6th assessment report for Working Group 2 and a lead author of IPCC's special report on global warming 1.5. She focuses on adaptation, sustainable development, and renewable energy. She is also a volunteer with Engineers Without Borders, Sense and Sensibility, and an editor of the Journal of Regional Environmental Change. Over to you for about 5 minutes, Debbie.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and a pleasure to be with all of you today. Just echoing some of the messages of Merle on the importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge in the different work, whether it's as practitioners or as science, and looking at synergies and trade-offs with SDGs and climate actions is how you incorporate different values and worldviews, and how you interpret that relationship that you have with nature. So not to repeat what Merle said about the differences between Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, but when we talk about how you implement the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals, a key component is leaving no one behind. So in looking, in working with indigenous peoples, at least from where I come from in the energy sector, in Central America, for example, we particularly look at, for renewable energy, how can you interpret these projects in a different way that's coherent and consistent with, for example, the Mayan cosmovision. So just as an example, in a rural Mayan community in Guatemala, the projects themselves don't change. It's just how you interpret the role of the project with nature, be it hydro or solar or wind. But now as we talk about a just energy transition, for example, and we're looking at critical mineral extraction, the role of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples is especially important, especially as we see with an increase in activity, how their rights and livelihoods are being damaged again. So I think something that's important to bring to mind is the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, number 169 of the International Labor Organization, and how that convention can be interpreted. So at least in some Central American countries, for example, the private sector who holds concessions to natural resources provided by the government would see that it's the government's role to implement this convention on how you get the free, prior, informed consent. Well, the government thinks, well, if I'm giving you the concession to the private sector, then it's their duty. But the problem of this is that nobody takes ownership, and it doesn't go beyond a checklist. So how can you make that convention really work to what it's supposed to do? Not just be a checklist, but really incorporate what it's supposed to mean. What are the different needs and perceptions and values that are at stake in any specific topic? So I think that while these issues, some like these, are not resolved, then there is a bigger barrier, at least at the practical level. In Latin America, there's another tool with the Escazú Agreement, which is more focused on availability and transparency of climate and environmental information. And one of the goals of it is to make information like the ones that derive from these COPs available to different local and indigenous populations, places where there's no internet or electricity. How can you get reliable information out there translated into different languages? But the problem there is that, well, not so much as a problem, but what is still being worked out is, for example, how do you do the feedback of these local populations whom you're trying to help, and not just have them provide them with information, but also get that feedback back into the process. So just in conclusion, because I know my 5 minutes are coming up, there needs to be trust when you do these processes, and then how you start interpreting information. So it needs to be a two-way conversation, and that these different international tools and mechanisms and dialogues need to work in that way. And at least what we've been able to see in Central America, it hasn't. So that does provide a barrier, because of course people don't feel listened or understood, or just feel like a bullet within a checklist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. I'd now like to bring Popular Gentle up to the stage. Popular has over 25 years of experience, research, policy, and the program interface, with a primary focus on climate change adaptation, natural governance, livelihoods, poverty reduction, and gender equality and social inclusion. He accomplished his PhD at Charles Sturt University in Australia, where he is also an adjunct senior fellow. He obtained his master's degree in forestry from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, and a master's in ecology from the Trivandrum University in Nepal. He served as the climate change and environmental advisor to the Right Honorable Prime Minister of Nepal, and his past assignments have included being the assistant country director for CARE International in Nepal, a team leader at Oxford Policy Management, and country director for IPAS USA in Nepal. He is currently affiliated with ClimAdapt. Over to you, Dr. Popular. Or Dr. Gentle. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hope it is working here. Thank you, Meryl, for your very important insights. Let me start my comments or my observations from a very different perspective. Based in Nepal, which is the most vulnerable country, where there is poverty, where there is social and gender-based inequalities. So how we see the linkage between SDG and climate actions is relatively different than how you see from the Western world. So first of all, I have some reservation about the term Western science. I am based in Nepal. I am doing research. I am contributing to knowledge. What is this? Is this Western science or just science or nothing? So I have a question about the term Western science. This term itself dominates. The science is Western. At least I highlighted indigenous science. That is great. This is the first time I heard indigenous science. That is great. But my question is, what I am contributing? Whether this is science or what? So impacts of climate change are mostly at the local level. And due to lack of context-specific vulnerability analysis and adaptation planning, our adaptation efforts are not mostly effective. This is basically due to lack of local and indigenous knowledge and practices while doing vulnerability analysis and adaptation planning. And I'm talking in the context of Nepal. Climate change is a major challenge in achieving SDG goals in Nepal. The ending poverty or hunger or reducing inequalities or education or health. These all are related to how climate change is impacting to the lives and livelihoods of people, and also the impacts on the gross domestic product, GDP of the country. Local and indigenous knowledge is extremely important while doing vulnerability analysis or adaptation planning or the mitigation related actions. Indigenous practices are mostly they provide the nature-based solutions. And it is very important to learn how people are coping, how they are surviving. For example, in the mountains, in the remote mountains of Nepal, how people are surviving. They are just depending on rain-fed, dry land agriculture. They don't have enough access to information, resources, capacity, but how they are surviving. So there must be some indigenous knowledge, practices, and technologies. So we have to invest to learn how they are coping. And another point is, while talking about indigenous knowledge and practices, we should not provide overburden to the indigenous people. They have limitation. The knowledge and practices generated by indigenous people or the local people is based on their experience. It is not based on the scenario. So we should not rely that indigenous knowledge is equally useful to tackle the unprecedented or the unpredictable future scenario. So we have to understand, we have to recognize the limitation of the local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, and we should not provide overburden to people. They need more resources, they need more capacity and information. So if we provide information, resources, and build capacity, definitely people can provide nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our three presenters. Thank you to Meryl, thank you to Debbie, thank you to Popular for sharing three very important perspectives, three very important ways of thinking about Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge at the intersection of climate action and SDG synergies. With our remaining time, I'd like to move us into a panel discussion. And at this time, I'm also going to invite Dr. Joanna Nalu to join us. Joanna Nalu is an associate professor and in fact an award-winning climate adaptation scientist who thrives on finding clues on how humans can better see into the future and adapt. Her research focuses on understanding climate adaptation heuristics and the roles that they play in adaptation decision and policy making. Joanna was a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 6th Assessment. She is a co-chair of the Science Committee for the World Adaptation Science Program at the United Nations and leads the Adaptation Science Research Theme at Cities Research Institute at Griffin University. So Joanna, if you could join us up on the stage here. So I'd like to ask just a series of questions to our panelists. And I'd like to start with Meryl. Do we still have both of our speakers there? Okay, thank you. And so, Meryl, starting with you, what steps do you see as necessary to enhance the influence of Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge in climate actions and SDG synergies?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. What needs to be done is that these knowledge systems have to be at the same value with the concept. We all know about the concepts of DEI, but we can apply DEI to knowledge as well, not just to people. But indigenous science, indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge need to be treated equally and at par with Western science, because Western science tends to think of itself as the domineering science, but indigenous science and indigenous knowledge have been around a lot longer than Western science, and it's the indigenous science that has enabled indigenous peoples to survive the land and to preserve the land. So it's important to start acknowledging the importance of indigenous science and Western science, and include indigenous peoples as partners in everything, in decision making. When the writing of reports, I always stress this: we don't have indigenous writers writing indigenous reports. It's always Western writers, and it has to change, because without our perspectives, we cannot. There can't be change.
Thank you for highlighting some of the key barriers, and also some really actionable ways in which we can overcome these. Popular to you, can you discuss some examples of projects where Indigenous and local knowledge either were crucial or perhaps not necessarily heeded in developing context-specific sustainable development and climate strategies?
Thank you, Elizabeth, again. Let me bring some experiences from my own projects that we implemented in Nepal. I will present one success case and another case, I can't say unsuccess, but challenging. The first one, where the adaptation project has capitalized the existing local knowledge, indigenous knowledge and practices. That adaptation project was highly successful. For example, Nepal has a long history of establishing community forestry through people's movement. They have their own indigenous and traditional systems in managing resources, in reaching to the most vulnerable and poor people with benefits. They have their own systems they have developed based on their indigenous and local knowledge. And we have another important institution that I say the farmer managed irrigation system. The commons, how local people are managing water resources and large irrigation systems in Nepal is totally community based. When the adaptation projects, they capitalize this knowledge. And this project was very much successful, utilizing the social capital, the institutional capital, the natural capital, and the rule of the games that the institutions have already developed. That was extremely important while doing the adaptation decisions. So this is the success case. Let me stop here. And another project where indigenous and local knowledge was not recognized, that was not successful. In Nepal, we have very age-long transhuman pastoral system where people, they migrate with their cattle from up hills and mountains to the lowlands, utilizing the changes in weather in different seasons. This system itself is a best example of spatial adaptation. What I have observed is the government-formed institutions or the formal institutions, they undermine the value of the local institutions, which were based on the customary rights, and they were informal. In the Western Nepal, there is a system of these pastoral communities that we call Thiti. When the development practitioners, mostly donor-funded projects. They started adaptation projects. They totally undermined the local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And then they just promoted the so-called formal institutions at the cost of how local people were contributing to enhance their natural resources, the pasture lands, the watersheds, water sources. So what happened at the end is there was a conflict between formal and informal institutions. And what it resulted is degradation of resources, and the conflict is still ongoing. So government is mostly taking side of formal institutions, and this is also a conflict between indigenous people and formal institutions and government, which is supporting only the formal institutions. So these are the very important things, and I am very much worried about the government, the position of the government just promoting and supporting the formal institutions and not respecting the contribution of the indigenous and local institutions and customary institutions. This is extremely important for adaptation planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Johanna, thank you for joining us. And my question for you is, how can we improve the use of diverse knowledges in assessments, such as those of the IPCC, to inform climate action and SDG synergies?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think so. My experience is obviously mainly from IPCC, but in the sixth assessment, we were lucky to have Indigenous authors, and I think that made a really big difference because they were able to give guidance to different authors across the chapter teams to enable better consideration of Indigenous knowledge. I think there's also, because IPCC can only assess what's out there, what people have published. So I think the inclusion of Indigenous authors in the author teams is really important, but also looking at the knowledge that has been produced. I think that's been really helpful and enriching, and I think we all obviously I'm not Indigenous, so but I've worked closely with many Indigenous authors and scholars and communities over many years, and I think it is about bringing that knowledge, but in a way that's respectful as well, and that's why we need more engagement of Indigenous people themselves in the assessment processes as well.
Thank you. Debbie, I'm going to ask you our final question for this panel. And I'm going to ask you, how do you envision strengthening these collaborations, those that support Indigenous knowledge in our climate adaptation and SDG assessments?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if you can hear me. I know you can't see me.
Yeah, we hear you, and you're correct
okay.
that we can't see you, but we hear you just fine.
Great, thank you. So I think just echoing what everybody else has said about how you include Indigenous peoples into the conversation, like into the assessments or into the different dialogues, and having that mutual understanding, the way that you incorporate their information and the inputs. I think one really good example that I've been part of is the different dialogues that the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, does as part of their assessment. So at the par with the different author meetings, there are different meetings with representative of Indigenous peoples from different parts of the world, covering the different regions, in which you go over the assessment and look at where the points where Indigenous knowledge can be strengthened. And then the dialogue reports also go through revision and approval of these indigenous groups before they are released to the public and can then be incorporated into the report. So just like, if there's 3 or 4 author meetings, then there's also the same number of dialogues. And I think that has helped a lot. Some of the indigenous authors that are part of IPBES are also part of this task group and are part of the dialogues. But it's this process that helps reinforce how indigenous knowledge is being incorporated, rather than looking for literature on indigenous knowledge or trying to fight tooth and nail to get some indigenous knowledge incorporated, because as Joanna mentioned, it's not in the peer-reviewed literature. So I think different processes like this are important and can certainly be replicated, not just for adaptation, but I think also, like when we're talking about the synergies and trade-offs with SDGs, with biodiversity, and especially always having this openness to what are the different values and worldviews that there are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Ballard. Thank you to Dr. Lay. Thank you to Dr. Gentle and to Dr. Nalu. What we've been, for all of your perspectives and everything that you've been able to guide us through this morning on the value of Indigenous science, the ways in which we can weave and braid Indigenous science and Western science to provide unique insights into climate action and SDG synergies, to the importance of co-creating knowledge, the importance of representation, both in scientific assessments and in practices in places from Nepal to Canada, and really the ways in which we can move this towards having a lasting impact on policy and implementation from local to global scales. Thank you so much.